Okay, this evening we are going to have a presentation titled Consciousness and Philosophy, Faith and Science. In science, consciousness is a perennial holy grail problem that is so abstruse most scientists ignore it or just call it an emergent property of the brain. But with a resurgent interest in the topic by neuroscientists, various scientific explanations are making their way into the literature. On the faith end of things, Eastern mystics have been talking about it for about 4,000 years, or more. And Judeo-Christian mystics have gotten a word or two in occasionally, mostly in ecstatic poetry in which what is sometimes called unity consciousness, and is compared to oneness with God. This talk will explore how different spiritual traditions relate to consciousness and compare what is said to what science has had to say about it from time to time. We have with us Dr. John Ambrosiano. He is a retired physicist who worked at the lab from 1997 until his retirement in 2019. In 2003, having become curious about Buddhism, he visited several centers in the Santa Fe area, including one in Los Alamos, guided by Henry Finney, an artist and Zen teacher affiliated with the Unitarian Church of Los Alamos. In Santa Fe, he met Buddhist teacher and author Matthew Flickstein and became his student in 2008. A few years later, he began training as a teacher himself and has been teaching Buddhism and meditation at the Unitarian Church since that time. Please join me in welcoming Dr. John Ambrosiano.
Thank you very much. I'm told I'm far too soft-spoken, so please tell me if you have trouble hearing me. You can't hear me? Really? I can hear me.
This is a philosophical difference.
I know. So, thank you for letting me know. Well, as Susan pointed out, this is just something I've been curious about for a long time. I just have to warn you that I don't have any training in philosophy, or hardly anything else except my Buddhist training. But I wanted to share with you some of the things I came across when I started exploring this. You probably won't be surprised to hear that the topic, consciousness, is kind of a black hole. So as soon as you start looking into it, it's like getting lost in Wikipedia. You just go away for days, and you don't eat. People don't know where you are. But I think I have something for you today that will at least hit the highlights in terms of philosophy, spirituality, and the science of it. So the way I'm going to thread through this talk is I'll just sort of pose the question, what is consciousness? I'll then go to Western philosophy and faith, and we'll hear about what some of the ancient philosophers thought about it, as well as some from the medieval era, and then we'll go from there into science. There's been a lot of work in science on consciousness, on the brain, on how we know what we know, and we'll cover some of those topics. Then we'll go back to Eastern philosophy and talk about the spiritual traditions there. Consciousness is a strong topic in Eastern spirituality, because much of what's done in those traditions is to go inside, explore one's own consciousness, and by doing that to understand what life is all about. So let's ask the question, what is consciousness? So it's probably not a bad idea to start with the dictionary. And if you go to the dictionary, if you go to the Oxford English Dictionary and Merriam-Webster, you'll find these. So we have that consciousness is the state or fact of being mentally conscious or aware of something. It's the faculty or capacity from which awareness of thought, feeling, and volition, and of the external world arises. It's the totality of impressions, thoughts, feelings that make up a person's sense of self and define a person's identity. It actually has an aggregate sense. It's the collective faculty of an aggregate of people, a set of shared ideas and belief. It is talked about in terms of what one is conscious of. Moral consciousness, religious consciousness, and so on. And it's being aware of our surroundings, and it's a normal condition of waking life. And it's also being aware of being aware. So it's being aware of whatever is going on inside of yourself. So after looking over those definitions, you can see there's sort of a structure to the way people think about consciousness. So one of the first things that you can see in that structure is that people will talk about consciousness, particularly if you're talking sort of metaphysically about consciousness. They'll talk about consciousness itself. What is consciousness? And they'll also talk about the contents of consciousness, thoughts, feelings, emotions, and so on. So it's like a TV drama. So we have As the Awareness Turns, and then the drama that plays out on TV is written by some person who is trying to entertain us. And this actually isn't a bad picture of how we actually relate to our consciousness. We tend to think of consciousness as being a container for all of these contents that flow through our minds. And there is a drama going on. It's the drama of ourselves. And it's a drama that we've been writing and revising the teleplay for since we were little kids. So it actually is a drama. So we call this drama the mind. And then the next thing that happens is we start to, as soon as we're little kids and we develop a sense of self, we start to divide the world into self and other. So there's a line, a boundary that comes down right in front of our faces, and everything on this side is inside, and everything on the other side is something else. So whenever we're referring to ourselves, we talk about an inner world, we talk about a self, we talk about the subject. And whenever we sort of look out on the outer world, we talk about the outer world, about other, and about objects. Now, the thing I want to let you in on right from the start is this is a completely phony, made-up line. Okay, there is no line that divides self from other. But we'll come back to that. So the self identifies very strongly with certain kinds of mental content. It's just the way it works. And in particular, it does self-identify with the intellect. It self-identifies with consciousness. It's just a natural thing for the self to do. It identifies a little less strongly with the body. And I'm not exactly sure why that's true, but we tend to talk about my consciousness. We talk about my body as if we owned the body. We talk about consciousness as if it was us. So this is another structure that forms in the mind, self and other. And that leads to the division between mind and body, at least in our minds and the minds of philosophers and people who think about these things. This is called the mind-body question. And the the reason it comes about is that the mind doesn't feel like the body feels. The body is physical, it has extension, we have a sense of where our body is at all times. The sensations that we take in from the body are quite straightforward. The senses, the five senses. So we have a brain. If we ask ourselves, where is consciousness coming from? We say, well, it's coming from our brain. So we certainly have a brain. And if we don't have a brain, we won't be conscious. But it's not really as simple as that. So there's something about the mind that feels immaterial, whereas the body feels very physical. And that leads us to feel like they're actually not made of the same thing. They're not made of the same stuff. So when we go into the philosophy and religious traditions of Western civilization, this body-mind question comes up. And in all of my readings on this topic, it seems like it always comes back to this question. It's sometimes called the body-mind problem. When I say that to people, sometimes they say, well, what's the problem? I mean, my mind works and my body works. Or you could call it the body-mind question. And the question is, what is the relationship between the mind and the body? If the mind's material, why can't I locate it? You can actually do this as an experiment if you want to just close your eyes sometime and try to find your mind. I think there's a song, isn't it? But if you just close your eyes and try to find the extent of your mind, the first thing that'll happen is you'll cheat and you'll say, well, it's in my brain, isn't it? So you'll feel around, you'll feel the sensations of your skull, and you say, I know where it is. It's right there. But then if you follow your thoughts, you realize your thoughts are unbounded. So your body is bounded in space. Your mind is not bounded. If you try to find the boundaries of your mind, you won't be able to find it. And if you try to find an edge to the mind, you won't be able to find it. It doesn't seem to be confined to the body at all. So if the body is immaterial, this is the question. If the mind is immaterial, how is it possible for it to influence a material body? How does that work? Is the mind of the same substance as the soul or of God? So Plato thought about this sort of thing. Plato thought about everything. In the Republic, he introduced the allegory of the cave to argue that the world that we apprehend with the senses is not real. It's a sort of a poor representation of reality. And he considered reality to be a product of the intellect, that when we saw forms, sort of crude forms in daily life, it was like prisoners chained to a wall. There's a fire behind the wall. There's a mischievous puppet show going on where the shadows are cast on the wall, but the prisoners only see the shadows. And whereas the reality is the objects that we're not seeing, these ideal shapes. That's the allegory of the cave. So for Plato, the human mind was, he felt, contained within the soul, that it could not be contained within the body because the body is too crude, too incomplete. It's always changing. It's never the same. The soul and the mind together possess the faculty of reason, and it's the faculty of reason that allows us to see the truth. And he believed that the soul survived after death. So Aristotle saw these things a little bit differently than Plato. Aristotle saw the body as sort of a golem It was a lifeless mechanism that could only be animated by the soul, and it was the soul that gave life to the body and gave reason to the mind as well. So he believed that reason couldn't arise from the physical brain alone, because he couldn't see how a finite material brain could accommodate the unbounded character of thought. So then there's Descartes. Descartes was a rationalist philosopher of the Enlightenment, and he believed there were two principal faculties of mind: the power of perception and the power of will. He argued that pure intellect requires nothing from the body, but that there are less pure things that enter the mind, like sense perception, imagination, and so on. And he believed that the mind were inherently different substances. This is what was called substance duality. So truth to Descartes is known by its clarity. So this is the sense that when we feel like we're onto the truth, that we see clearly, that we're confident that what we have perceived is the truth. And he says that is a property of the will, that judgment based on the will is what tells us what's true. And that's why he said what he said, which is that I think, therefore I am. So, St. Augustine was a profound philosopher and theologian. And to Augustine, the soul was the source of all perception, rational thought, all the contemplative powers of the mind. He felt that these powers mirrored the God's own power, and that God was the ultimate source of spiritual and natural law, reflected, his image reflected in our intellect. Augustine believed that faith and reason are inseparable, and he addressed the problem of the mind and the body. There's a problem that comes up when you believe you have an immaterial mind and a material body, especially if you lived in the Middle Ages. It's sort of like, how does a ghost turn a doorknob? Okay, can a ghost turn a doorknob? How does he do it? It didn't seem reasonable to a lot of thinkers at that time that an immaterial entity could affect a physical body. So the way Augustine thought about it was that the soul is actually the immaterial part of a human being, and it's situated between the body and God. And in some of the Christian thinkers at the time actually thought that God intervened in every moment to allow your mind to control your body. I don't think Augustine thought that, but he did situate the soul between the body and God. And so that brings us to self-awareness and the question of free will. So one of the reasons that Augustine had the body situated the way it was is he felt that man's inclinations were inherently sinful. He actually coined the term original sin. It came from Augustine. And so in Christianity, humans start out sort of tilted the wrong way, and then we have to rely on God's grace and our own free will to rebalance the good and the evil inclinations that we may have. The Torah teaches that God is completely fair, and that he balances our inclinations for good or for evil from the beginning, from the time we're born. The Quran has an interesting duality that I found really interesting. It seems to simultaneously preach predestination and free will. So the predestination comes from the understanding that God is all-powerful, and that everything that happens or will happen is by God's command. So that includes whatever we do and whatever happens to us. But at the same time, God will judge us on Judgment Day. He will have us account for everything we've done. So it seems like a paradox. How can we have free will if God commands everything we do? And what chance do we have if God has already decided who's going to have to account for their wrongdoings and who won't? So the way I look at it is it's a faith teaching, and it's not a blind faith. That is to say, that I'll just believe that this is the way things are. It's more like a puzzle. It's a duality that we're faced with, and in teachings, non-dual teachings like Buddhism, a koan is a puzzle that appears to be irreconcilable, and it's held in the mind, simply held in the mind. These two opposites are held in the mind without judgment. And as one does that, eventually the rational mind lets go, and the heart opens, and we simply accept what is. So that's the way I see this particular paradox. And I think that this is probably also true of the paradox of the Trinity in Christianity, that the Holy Trinity is three and one at the same time. So let's see how science looks at consciousness. So first of all, science is a natural philosophy. Because scientists are naturalists, they really don't want to deal with any sort of supernatural component of the mind-body problem. Science is basically a game where you're allowed to go as far as you can in assigning natural causes to phenomena, but as soon as you go past natural causes into the supernatural, you're not doing science anymore. So consciousness is a really difficult problem in science. It's so difficult that scientists really haven't pursued it at all until fairly recently. But that seems to be changing. So the natural place to look into the mind is in the science of psychology. It's supposed to be the science of the mind. It should naturally address consciousness in some way. And psychologists are human beings. They have the same difficulty that we have. They have no way of knowing what people are thinking or how they're feeling, except in terms of how they report that to them. So they have to rely on subjective reporting. There's always been this subjective component of psychology. So two of the most famous psychologists that ever lived were Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung. They practiced psychology in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And they each had a theory of consciousness, a theory of the mind. So Freud's theory involved three states of mind: consciousness, pre-consciousness, and the unconscious or the subconscious. So consciousness is what we're actively aware of. Pre-consciousness is what we could be aware of, but if we really wanted to be. And the unconscious or the subconscious are things of which we are unaware, but that still condition our behavior. Freud thought that psychological disorders came from tension or conflicts between the subconscious side of our minds and the conscious part. And he also divided the mind up into these other divisions. The id is instinctual and physical. The ego is pretty much what we regard as the self, and the superego is that which sort of intervenes between the ego and the id. Now, Jung didn't really like everything Freud had to say, even though he was his mentor at one time. And he also believed that much of the mind is unconscious. But he divided up a little bit differently. He divided the unconscious part of the mind into the unconscious and the collective unconscious. The collective unconscious is where the influences of culture and language and all of that conditioning come into play. So this went on for a while until behaviorism came along. The behaviorists looked at what was going on with Freud and the analysts and thought this was crazy. He thought all of these ideas were stories that were made up, that the mind didn't work that way. And in fact, they didn't want to know how the mind worked. They actually wanted to make psychology a real grown-up science. And so they insisted that all of their observations be strictly direct observations of behavior without any conjecture about what's going on in somebody's mind. And in fact, they refused to take into account any subjective data from the patients. They believed that was unreliable. So as you probably know, B.F. Skinner was the most famous proponent of the behaviorists, and this rejection of subjective experience by the behaviorists went on for a very long time, from the 1920s into the mid-50s. And so there was a period in psychology where we really didn't care what people were thinking or feeling or anything except how they were behaving. So partly as a reaction to behaviorism, and also because neuroscience was coming onto the scene, a branch of psychology emerged called functional psychology. It was actually started by William James, who is a very famous philosopher and psychologist and writer. He was into all sorts of things. He wrote a very famous book called The Varieties of Religious Experience, where he looked at mystical experiences from around the world and documented their commonalities. He also experimented with anesthesia, as people did at that time. He used peyote and chloroform and nitrous oxide, and he said it wasn't until he was under the influence of nitrous oxide that he understood Hegel. So he had a very interesting take on things. He was one of the founders of functional psychology. Now, functional psychology is getting away from this sort of structuralism of Freud and Jung. So instead of sort of making up structures that exist in the mind, they actually wanted to know what sort of functions the mind performed. And they were inspired by Darwin, so they wanted to to learn what sort of things the mind does that are adaptive, that are that enable a human being to better survive, that make them fitter. And so some of the mental functions they considered to be biologically adaptive were things like hunger, naturally. They wanted to know how that worked. They wanted to look into fear, the nature of memory, language and sexual attraction. They looked into play. They understood that play had an adaptive purpose, that it was actually preparing the organism, and the human being in particular, for situations that they weren't going to encounter right away. These were things that they were sort of simulating in their minds in order to better adapt to them. And selective attention, laughter, and this one surprised me, cognitive dissonance. So we think of cognitive dissonance as being a bit of a problem, that we know people, including maybe ourselves, who have two opposing sort of incompatible views that they hold in their minds at the same time, irrespective of what the evidence is. But functional psychology sees this as an adaptation, that the mind can only take so many paradoxes. It can only function under so much stress. And so cognitive dissonance is a way of dealing with that. So that's functional psychology. And functional psychology started to really mesh with the discoveries that were being made in neurology. So I know you've heard of Broca's center in the brain. I wasn't sure I had ever heard of Wernicke's, but Broca and Wernicke worked together on various projects. And they got, mainly the neurologists at the time were getting their data from people with brain injuries or a disease condition of the brain. And they would notice, of course, that with certain kinds of injuries, certain parts of the brain were not functioning properly. And then they started to correlate these things. So Broca and Wernicke actually did autopsies on the brain of aphasic patients, and they discovered where these language centers were. Aphasia is what happens when you lose your power of speech from a stroke or from a lesion. And so they were able to discover from that there's actually two centers that are responsible for language. One is responsible for the processing of language, and the other is responsible for its comprehension. So that's Wernicke Center. So as I was looking into this, I came across a really bizarre case that I wasn't sure we had time for, but it's really too good not to talk about. So this was the case of a man named Gage, Phineas Gage. And Phineas Gage was a railroad engineer who was setting a powder charge and was tamping it down with a tamping iron. And he got distracted, and the charge it sparked and went off, and the tamping iron flew up through his mouth, through his skull, and into the brain. And there's pictures of of the brain, which actually shows the path of the tamping rod, and it's just amazing. What's amazing about this story is that he fell onto his back when the explosion went off. He convulsed for a bit, and then he got up, spoke, walked to an ox cart with a little help, and they drove him home. He lived for 22 years after that accident, but his friends said that he wasn't the same person anymore. Before the accident, he was a very nice person. After the accident, he wasn't a very nice person. When they looked at the path of the tamping rod, they could see that it had gone not only through the left parts of the left and right frontal lobe, but through some of the gray matter that connects those. And it caused a profound personality change. So this is what neurologists and anatomists were up to in that period. And this is how they gained information about the brain. And they used that information over time to map various areas of the brain. And so in terms of the gross structure of the brain, we now have a very decent idea of where functions are located in the brain. There's still some mysteries and debates about what's going on. But by and large, this program of study has made it possible for us to know a lot more about the brain and its functions than we did before. So one of the most famous findings is the understanding, this goes back to Broca and the language centers, is that the left and right brain hemispheres are not symmetric. So we know that language is principally the responsibility of the left brain, and we have some ideas about what the right brain does. So the things you've heard about left brain and right brain people, and you know who you are, those things are a myth. Okay, the recent findings on brain lateralization show that both hemispheres of the brain really are involved in all the functions of the mind. So it's not a simple cartoon of, if you're mathy, your left brain, and if you're a painter, your right brain. It just doesn't work that way. But I found there were some really interesting, specific ways in which the brain is different in attention. And so, as it happens, the left hemisphere is, the attention in the left hemisphere is very focused. The right brain is vigilant, so it has a sort of a broader kind of focus and can remain, can have a sustained alertness for a long period of time. The left deals with just one thing at a time. That's the way it likes things. While the right brain likes to work with a lot of things at once. The left prefers to refine what it knows. So if there were a left brain person and you were a right brain person and you were working on a problem together, you might get a little frustrated if the left brain person kept wanting to do the same thing over and over again instead of looking for a solution to the problem. So in problem solving, the left brain wants to use the most familiar solution, while the right brain likes to cast about for new things. It's prospecting for gold. The left brain generally divides and discriminates, while the right brain synthesizes and integrates. And this was from the same sources I got this information. I learned that it's actually the left brain that inhibits the right brain. So what's interesting about these findings is that when you see that the brain has different modes of attention, you can see, going back to functional psychology, that they're both adaptive. So there are times when a person needs to be very focused on just one thing, just one tiger, okay? And there are other times when that's just not the thing to do. You have to be able to cast about, or you have to be vigilant. You have to be able to sort of be taking in the world in a much more open way. And one reason that's interesting to me is that when we learn to meditate in our tradition, we learn both concentration meditation and mindfulness meditation. And this is sort of the physiological basis for that. So concentration meditation wants to look at one thing and keep attention on it to the exclusion of everything else, which is how we get started, because the mind is just a palace of monkeys. And so the concentration practice is there to help stabilize the mind. But once that begins to take hold, then we go to mindfulness meditation, which is more open. And in ideal meditation session, both of those will be equally involved in our attention. And I thought that was interesting. So, so what we've been talking about up to now is how neurology explores how the mind works. It tries to correlate functions with things like brain injuries, and as things have moved forward, we can also do experiments of that same kind by anesthetizing certain parts of the brain. We can use imaging techniques. We can use transcranial magnetic stimulation to pretty precisely stimulate one part of the brain over another. But all of that is not really getting to the mind-body problem that we were so curious about. What we want is scientific findings that tie physical processes that occur in the brain and elsewhere to the reported subjective experiences of human beings. At this point, we care about this subjective experience. We want to know what they're thinking, what they're feeling, and how that correlates with consciousness, how that correlates with activity in the brain. So this is called the search for neural correlates of consciousness, and this has been the way in which this research has gone on in recent years. Neurologists have studied consciousness by looking as deeply as they can into what the brain is doing and comparing that to the conscious experience of people. So this eventually leads us to theoretical models of consciousness. Now, these are models. I'll go back in a minute. So these are models of consciousness that actually tried to tie these results from neurological correlates of consciousness to some kind of theory. And it's not just a theory like Freud's theory where he sort of made up some story that seemed reasonable at the time. These are theories that are intended to have predictive power. And by that I mean that if the theory is right, you should be able to make a statement about where consciousness is likely to affect the mind and the brain. So for example, there are a lot of things from these neural correlate studies that are just interesting. Some of them involve realizing that some parts of the mind that are very active in imagery are completely asleep. You can have unconscious patients who have some part of the brain going, a mile a minute, and they're completely out. That happens in anesthesia all the time. So it's not as nice as those wonderful pictures are of neurological imaging. They don't necessarily tell you what people are conscious of or how consciousness is working. So these theoretical models have emerged. And there are two models that are vying for attention right now. They're both computable. They're both mathematical models of consciousness. And one is called the Global Workspace Theory, or GWT, and the other is called the Integrated Information Theory, or IIT. Now, if you're a mathematician or a computer scientist, you might read integrated information theory as information theory that's been integrated. Okay, but that's not actually what it's talking about. It's actually talking about a theory of integrated information. Because one of the things that's emerged recently is the sense that consciousness, we become conscious of things when the little bits of information that are unconscious at the moment are synthesized somewhere and made available to consciousness. In global workspace theory, The idea is that borrowed, stolen from computer science, is that there's a workspace in the mind. They think it might actually be in the thalamus, and they believe that there's a workspace in the mind where little bits of information are processed. They sort of cascade their way up into areas of the cortex that are responsible for certain functions, and then they compete for attention. They will try to, let's say the workspace is in the thalamus, they'll try to broadcast a signal to the thalamus, and it may or may not get there because it's competing with other signals that are trying to get there. But after this plays itself out, then there's a synthesis of that information in this workspace area. In the global workspace theory, it's said to be thresholded, that consciousness, once that information is there, if it's at a certain level of intensity, it will become conscious, will be conscious of that experience. So that's the global workspace theory. That's the one that's easy to understand. The one that's not easy to understand is the theory of integrated information. So this is a theory that was proposed by Tononi in 2004 and now has a lot of interest around the world. As I was watching a YouTube video on this topic, I had to watch like 16 of them before I got even a general idea of what this was. But one of these videos was from a conference on what they called computational phenomenology. Okay. Who knew there was such a thing? Phenomenology historically is a very intense philosophical area where we try to understand how the mind takes in all this information, all of these things that are impinging on it all the time, and how that impacts our life. So integrated information theory is actually a kind of computational phenomenology. And one of the interesting things about it is that it has a particular approach that is different from what scientists often try to do. Often they try to go bottom up from the neurons to conscious experience. That's a long way to go from billions of neurons to your conscious experience. What Tononi did instead is he said, look, consciousness is real. That's actually his first axiom. Consciousness is real. We have conscious experiences. So let's not pretend we don't. And then he stated 5 axioms that he felt would support a theory of experience, human experience. So the first one is intrinsic experience, that consciousness is real, that it exists. The axiom of composition, that there's a lot going on in any experience, that any given experience is composed of a lot of different little experiences, and that they're all distinct. That there is information involved, because remember, we're looking at the integration of information as to give us a sense of how we become conscious. So so the information postulate just says that every experience has an information content. So if I'm in my bedroom on a bed and I'm reading a blue book, okay, those are all bits of information that distinguish that experience I'm having from another experience that I might have. So information is involved. It's not, as far as I can tell, there's no mention of Shannon's information theory in this model, but the fact that experience requires information to become conscious is a postulate. And then there's this idea of integration, what integration is. And this is the strange part of it, but it seems to make sense. Consciousness is integrated information. That's the postulate. That's what it is. and that it's measured as the power of a conscious system to affect change. That is, that a conscious system has the ability to make a difference from going from past experience to present experience and into the future. And what Tononi does is to then create a model system, or propose that there are model systems that we can build called substrates. And those systems are basically networked systems. They're made of computational pieces hooked together. And if you know what you're doing, you can measure what he calls the cause-effect power of this system. And there's a lot of math in that. But it seems to have attracted a lot of attention. There are predictions of both global workspace theory and integrated information theory that seem to have been borne out by these studies in neural correlates of consciousness. They don't actually predict the same ones. So global workspace theory will predict one that IIT won't, and vice versa. So that's IIT. And the interesting thing about both of these is that they're computable. So for those of you that like to code, sometime when you're not doing anything else, you could look into this and actually simulate consciousness. Just go ahead. So GWT and IIT do show promise, but they are very, very technical. So that means there are only a few people, like the kind of people that show up at computational phenomenology workshops that really get excited about these things, or really have a sense for how they relate to consciousness at all. And neither of them solves the mind-body problem. Neither of them can say why, at a given threshold, the mind is conscious of this integrated information. Why this intuition that Tononi had about the cause-effect power of the mind, why should that make something conscious? And remember that the basic issue in the mind-body problem is that we have an immaterial mind and a material body. And so that means that it's still unresolved. This is an immaterial mind that these folks are talking about. It is information. Information is immaterial. Most of the information I convey is immaterial, but that's another thing altogether. So, so that's what's going on in science. And I want to just say a little bit about, come back to religion and philosophy, and this time from an Eastern point of view. So in Eastern traditions of spirituality are a little bit different. And if I had to really come down on one particular thing that is common to all these traditions, it's the understanding that life is an illusion. Now, I don't mean that to say that life isn't real, that you don't have to be careful when you cross the street or anything like that. It just means that everything that we relate to in the outer world is being painted in our minds, by our minds. It's a representation. It's not real. It's the map. It's not the territory. So what many of these practices, what many of these traditions is about, is introducing practices that can stabilize their mind, open the mind, and allow one to go inside and actually touch reality with their consciousness. The most important thing that a person can do in their life, if they're following these traditions, is to wake up in their lifetime. So nearly all of these traditions have the same roots. They can be ultimately traced, at least in our history, to the Vedic traditions in India. By going within these Vedic sages, these rishis were able to get a sense, a glimpse of the absolute reality. And they called it self with a capital S. So when you hear self in this context. They're talking about the ultimate reality. What we take to be our individual self, the small s, is a set of concepts. This is consensus across these traditions. What we take to be our self is a set of concepts that we've woven into a story since the time we were like 6 years old or 3 years old. And we just keep doing that over and over again since we were children. But our true nature is actually much grander. So, famous figures in this, the Buddha, who we've talked about before. He was a privileged, a person of privilege who left to find out find the solution to what was bothering him, which is he couldn't understand where human suffering was coming from. He knew people suffered. They got old, sick, and died. Can't avoid that. But they seemed to suffer way beyond the misfortunes that came their way. So what he found is that, as I said, that people are basically caught in a dream that they take to be real, and they take themselves to be real as well. So it leads to greed, self-centeredness, anger, all of these things that disturb and perturb our lives and the lives of other people. All these traditions have non-dual aspects. So one of the reasons that we become disturbed, that our consciousness is disturbed, is we get caught in these paradoxes, these dualisms, where things have to, it's just the way our minds work. They have to work that way for us to be able to reason on them. That's why they work that way. So every time something appears to consciousness, we automatically think of its opposite, so that we can tell the difference between the thing that we have in our hand and something else we might have in our hand. And that's just the way the mind works. It's a very useful faculty, but it's not the way life really is. Life isn't divided into this thing and that thing. Life is whole. And these things are just practical conventions that we hold in our mind. So non-duality tries to break that spell by allowing the person through practice to see that all of these opinions and these opposites that carry around in their mind are just creations of the mind. And the result is that they are able to lead more contented lives. Another famous person among these traditions is Lao Tzu, who may or may not have existed. That's the way China is. But we can say he did. There is a body of writing, the Tao Te Ching, that is attributed to him. And it's a set of very deep teachings. Taoism is guided by a sense of wholeness in the world, and the sense that life is naturally unfolding as it must due to causes and conditions, and that's just how it works. So I think do I have time to finish this? Like 3 slides, okay. All right. So questions about free will just don't come up because they just don't matter. Whether there's free will or not, whether there's determinism or not, doesn't matter. Life simply is. So the teachings on non-self. So when we were looking at Western traditions, the acquisition of a self is something that happens psychologically and naturally at about age 4. You can't stop it, okay? But we take that to be real. In these traditions, we try to get past that. And so the teachings on non-self, that there is no enduring, permanent self that is at the center of our conscious experience. It's just a convention that we make up. When you get past that, when you realize that life is simply unfolding, so we're not going to control life. I mean, we may be able to control what we have for dinner, but not much beyond that. And that when you realize that these boundaries and these preferences exist only in the mind, and that there's really nothing that separates us from the other, then compassion naturally arises. So one of the things I run into when I teach is that people say, well, if this stuff is real, it isn't real. If right and wrong and morality are just concepts in the mind, I guess I can do anything I want. But it doesn't really work that way. What happens is that as you become deeper immersed in these things, you see that there is nothing that separates me from any one of you. I wouldn't harm any of you any more than I would deliberately harm myself. Why would I do that? So compassion and love naturally arise. You don't need a lot of rules of morality, although that may take a little time to develop. So all of these traditions also have guidelines for skillful behavior. And that's so that you don't get yourself into trouble while you're waiting to wake up. But this is why it's not necessary to worry about whether there's a self and whether the self is there to keep you out of trouble morally. It takes care of itself, because as the boundaries fall away, there really is no problem. Compassion and love simply are there. And so that's why we can turn to Matthew 22:37-9, where Christ says, "Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, and with all thy soul, and with all thy mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. The second is like unto it, thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself." In non-dual traditions, the second teaching is automatic because we are our neighbor. And the first is also natural because there's nothing that separates us from God. We are the ultimate reality. So the mind-body problem just doesn't come up. There's no mind-body dualism in Eastern traditions because there's no mind, only sensations passing through consciousness, feelings, perceptions, thoughts, and so on. There's no body apart from all the parts that make up our body. And both are simply mental constructs. So I'm going to skip this because I've actually said this already. Consciousness, there's a little c consciousness that is what we sort of conventionally talk about when we talk about our consciousness. But there is the ultimate consciousness, which we can call consciousness. It doesn't mean that when we're in the ultimate consciousness, we're like seeing through everybody's eyes, or something weird like that. It just means that we recognize that everything is conscious. And it's also called the ultimate reality, the ground of being, God, and self with a big S. So I just wanted to end by saying that whatever consciousness is, it's very precious. It's a very precious thing. This is something that all the Eastern traditions recognize, particularly the ones that believe in reincarnation. If you're going through thousands of lives, and only a few of those lives, maybe only one of those lives will be as a human being. And so that means that whenever you are a human being, that opportunity is precious. It's your opportunity to wake up. So I would say that the ultimate question is not what is consciousness, but what will you do with the precious human consciousness that you've been given. And that's it. Thank you.